I had seen a lot of things in that parking garage. I'd seen executives cry in the back seat. I'd seen women in $1,000 heels kick off their shoes the second the door closed. I'd seen people fall asleep mid-sentence after 16-hour days, their faces finally soft and unguarded in a way they'd never allow in a boardroom. I thought I had seen everything. Then the elevator doors opened on the 14th floor of the Aldrin Tower, and I saw her. And just like that, 5 years, 2 cities, one silence that I had convinced myself was healed. None of it mattered. My chest did something it had no right to do. I was holding a paper cup of coffee I'd just picked up from the lobby. I remember looking down at my hand, making sure it wasn't shaking. It wasn't. But everything else was. She hadn't seen me yet. She was talking to someone beside her, nodding with that specific focus I used to know so well, the kind that meant she was listening but already thinking 3 steps ahead. Her dark coat. The way she carried herself like the room had been waiting for her to arrive. I took one breath, then another. Don't react. You're the driver. That's all you are. She turned. And the second her eyes found mine, that half-second of stillness before either of us knew what to do with our faces, I understood something I'd spent 5 years trying to ununderstand. Some things don't go away. They just wait. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. I need to go back. Because if I just tell you what happened in that parking garage, you won't understand why it meant what it meant. And I need you to understand. 5 years ago, I was 24 years old and new to Boston. I had a commercial driver's license, a studio apartment with a broken radiator, and a job with an executive transport company called Meridian. We weren't a rideshare. We were the kind of service that major corporations kept on retainer. Discreet, professional, expensive. The kind of drivers who knew how to be invisible. I was good at being invisible. My supervisor, Carmen, assigned me to a new account that October. A tech company called Vela Systems. They were growing fast, Series B funding, a flagship product in predictive analytics that had just gotten picked up by 3 Fortune 500 clients. The CEO was young, late 30s. She had built the company herself from a 2-person team in a Cambridge garage to a staff of 400 in less than 7 years. Her name was Lyra Aldrin. My first time picking her up, I was early. I always was. I pulled the car around to the side entrance of the Vela building on Newberry Street and waited. 7:45 in the morning. The city was still waking up, gray and cold, the kind of November morning that smells like rain that hasn't fallen yet. She came out at exactly 7:50. Not late, not rushed, just precise. She got in, looked at the route I'd pulled up on the mounted tablet and said, "Take the side streets. I hate the Pike in the morning." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She looked up from her phone. Something crossed her face. Not quite amusement, not quite annoyance. Something in between. "Please don't call me that," she said. "I'm Lyra." I nodded. Lyra. That was the beginning of it, though I didn't know it yet. For the first 3 weeks, we were nothing to each other. I drove, she worked. Sometimes she made calls in the back seat, and I kept my eyes on the road and my hearing professionally elsewhere. Sometimes she was quiet in a way that felt comfortable rather than cold. The silence of someone who doesn't perform for an audience, even a small one. I noticed things. I always noticed things. It was part of the job. I noticed that she always had 2 phones, one for calls, one for reading. I noticed she drank her coffee black and got annoyed when the morning assistant sent anything with sweetener. I noticed she had a habit of pressing her thumb against the inside of her wrist when she was thinking hard about something, like she was checking her own pulse. I noticed the way she looked out the window when the route took us past the Charles River. Like the water was something she needed. One morning in early December, she finished a call and didn't go back to her phone. She looked out the window for a while. Then she said, without turning around, "Do you listen to music when you drive?" I glanced at her in the rear view. Not on client routes. Why not? Seemed like it might be intrusive. A pause. Then, it wouldn't be. Not for me. I don't know why that felt like something. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a door that had been politely closed for 3 weeks had been left, just slightly, ajar. From that day on, I played music on the way to her morning pickups. Low and instrumental. Nothing that demanded attention. She never said anything about it. But she stopped working immediately when she got in. She'd sit back and just be still for a few minutes. Like the music gave her permission to not be on for a little while. I didn't think about what that meant. I just kept driving. The shift in our dynamic happened the way most shifts do. So gradually that you can't point to the exact moment. By January, she was talking to me. Not small talk. Lyra Aldrin did not do small talk. She talked about things she was thinking through, a restructuring decision she wasn't sure about, a board dynamic that frustrated her, an acquisition the investors were pushing that she thought was wrong for the company's trajectory. She wasn't asking for my opinion at first. She was just thinking out loud. I listened. I drove. And sometimes when a pause stretched a little longer than the others, I offered something. Quietly. Carefully. Not pretending to understand boardrooms or venture capital, but I understood people. I understood pressure. I understood what it felt like to carry something you couldn't put down. "You think I'm being stubborn," she said to me once, about the acquisition. "I think you know your company better than they do," I said. Another silence. Then, that might be the same thing. She didn't acquire the company. 3 months later, the target business collapsed after a bad Series C. She never mentioned that I'd been right. But the next morning, when she got in the car, she brought 2 coffees. "Yours is black," she said. I guessed. She had guessed right. I don't know when the morning started to feel like something I looked forward to. I don't know when I started paying attention to how she smelled. Something clean and faint, like cedar and cold air. I don't know when I started noticing which days her voice was tight with something unspoken, and which days there was a softness underneath the efficiency. I just know that by March, something was different. Not between us, exactly. Inside me. I told myself it was admiration. She was remarkable. Anyone could see that. She was the kind of person who made the air in a room feel more organized just by walking into it. Of course, I found her compelling. It didn't mean anything. I was very good at telling myself things didn't mean anything. The real problem started on a Thursday in April, when she asked me to wait for her outside a client dinner at a restaurant in the Back Bay. The dinner ran late. By the time she came out, it was past 11, and she looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen before. Not physically, but somewhere deeper. Like something had cost her more than she'd expected. She got in and didn't say anything for 3 blocks. Then, "Do you ever get tired of being steady?" I didn't answer immediately. I turned that question over. "No," I said. "I think steady is how I stay sane." She looked at me in the rear view for a long moment. Not the quick, assessing glance she usually gave. Something slower. "Must be nice," she said quietly. It was such a small thing to say, and it broke something open in my chest that I spent the entire drive home trying to close back up. Spring in Boston is a trick. It promises warmth and then takes it back, over and over, until one day it just doesn't. I was sitting in the car outside her building on a Wednesday morning in early May when I finally admitted something to myself. I was hoping she would be in a mood to talk. Not because talking was my job, but because I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to see what version of her would get into the car that morning. I sat with that thought for about 4 seconds before I started rationalizing it. "You're attentive to your clients. That's professionalism. That's it." I believed it. I was very motivated to believe it. The day it stopped being possible to believe it was a Thursday in late May. Lyra had a 2-day trip to New York. Investor meetings, a product showcase, a dinner. She asked Meridian to arrange transport both ways, and Carmen assigned me. It was normal. I'd done overnight trips before. I drove her down on the first morning, waited for her at the hotel, drove her to meetings, waited again. It was the evening of the second day that everything shifted. The showcase dinner had ended early. She came out of the venue looking lighter than I'd seen her in weeks. Something had gone well. I could tell by the way she walked. There was a looseness to her shoulders that wasn't usually there. She got in and said, "We have 2 hours before the last stop. I want to see the water." I looked at the clock. It was technically outside the scope of what I'd been asked to do. I said, "Brooklyn Bridge Park?" "Perfect." We drove there in a comfortable quiet. I parked near the waterfront and she got out, and after a second's hesitation, so did I. I didn't think about it. It just seemed wrong to stay in the car while she stood looking at the East River at dusk. She didn't look surprised that I'd followed. She just glanced over when I stopped beside her, and then looked back at the water. The skyline was doing something extraordinary with the light, pinks and golds, and the kind of heavy blue that comes right before dark. The river moved the way rivers do at that hour, unhurried, indifferent, enormous. We stood there without speaking for a while. Then she said, "I built Vela because I was angry." I looked at her. There was a company I worked at when I was 27. I had an idea, a real one, the kind you don't get very often. I brought it to the leadership team. A pause. They told me to write it up and send it to them. 8 months later, they launched a product that was mine. Word for word, almost. They gave the credit to someone else. I didn't say anything. I left that night, she said. I drove home and I sat in my kitchen for 3 hours and I thought about every single thing I would have to sacrifice to do it myself. Every risk. Every version of it going wrong. She was quiet for a moment, and then I thought about what it would feel like to watch someone else take something from me again. The river moved. That was the last time I let anyone take something from me, she said. I understood then that she wasn't just telling me a story about a company. She was telling me something about herself, about the cost of who she had to become to protect everything she'd built. I said, "Was it worth it?" She turned and looked at me. Not the rear-view mirror look. The full, real, direct version of her eyes that I'd rarely gotten that close to. "I don't know yet," she said. And something happened in that moment that I cannot fully explain. The light was doing what it was doing. She was looking at me the way she was looking at me. And I felt, with a clarity that terrified me, that I was in trouble. Not professionally. The other kind. I looked back at the water. I kept my face completely neutral. I kept my breathing measured. I was composed and professional and absolutely internally falling apart. We stood there for another 15 minutes. Then she said she was ready, and we walked back to the car, and I drove her to her last meeting, and I said nothing. Not one word about what had just shifted in the air between us. Because maybe nothing had shifted. Maybe it was just the light and the river, and a long 2 days away from the routine that made everything feel more saturated than it actually was. Maybe. I kept saying maybe for the rest of the spring. But I started noticing other things. The way she said my name, May, when she wanted my attention. The specific weight of it. There are people who say your name and it lands flat, like a word. There are people who say your name and it lands like they mean something by it. Lyra was in the second category, and she had been since the beginning, and I hadn't let myself look at that directly until now. I noticed that she remembered things. Small things. I had mentioned once, in passing, that I'd grown up in Virginia near the water, that my mother still lived there, that I came up to Boston on a job offer, and mostly stayed because I liked the winters. She never referenced it directly, but months later, when we drove past the harbor on a particularly cold morning, she said, "Does this remind you of home?" Just like that, no preamble. I had to grip the wheel a little harder. I told myself this was what Lyra Aldrin was like with everyone she kept close. She paid attention. She remembered. It was the same intelligence that made her exceptional at her work. It wasn't personal. I was so invested in that interpretation. But here's what I couldn't rationalize away. She talked to me differently than she talked to anyone else. I drove her to meetings, to dinners, to events where I waited in the car or the lobby and watched her operate in rooms full of people who wanted things from her. She was magnetic and deliberate and impeccably calibrated out there. Every word was considered. Every gesture was controlled. In the car, she let sentences trail off. She asked questions she didn't know the answer to. She laughed sometimes. A real laugh, not the polished version she kept for rooms. At something small and inconvenient, like a reroute that added 20 minutes or a coffee that was the wrong temperature. She was a different person in the car. Or maybe she was the same person, and the car was just the one place she didn't have to pretend she wasn't. Either way, I was the one who got that version of her. And I knew, with a sinking, specific certainty, that I had started to need it. In June, I made a decision. I requested a reassignment from Carmen. Professional growth, I said. I wanted exposure to more accounts. Diversify my client experience. Carmen raised an eyebrow. The Vela account is one of our best. I know, I said. I think that's why it's a good time to move. She approved it. I had 3 days before the new assignment started. On the last morning I drove Lyra, she got in as usual. Black coffee, the soft instrumental music. The city moving outside the windows. She worked for the first part. Then she put her phone down and looked out the window for a while. "Carmen told me you requested a reassignment," she said. I kept my eyes on the road. "Yes." A pause. Not a short one. Was it something I did? And that was the moment. That was the exact moment when I understood that whatever I was feeling, it wasn't only going in one direction. Because no executive asks their driver that. Not like that. Not with that particular quiet in their voice. I said, "No." It was something I needed to figure out. She didn't ask what. She looked out the window for the rest of the drive. When I pulled up to the Vela building, she got out and then turned and looked at me through the open door. "I hope you figure it out," she said. And then she walked away and I watched her go, and I told myself that was the right decision. That I had done the smart, safe, professional thing. That I would be fine. I moved to a new account. I drove other executives across the city. I was steady and invisible and good at my job. But I thought about her. For months, I thought about her. The way she'd stood at the river. The way she'd said my name. The way she'd asked, was it something I did? Like my leaving mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with transport logistics. I convinced myself eventually that I'd imagined the weight of all of it. That I'd projected something onto a professional relationship because I was lonely or restless or simply susceptible to extraordinary people. I left Meridian the following spring. Got a job offer at a different company. Better pay, more flexibility, the chance to expand. I moved to Chicago for 2 years, then back to the East Coast when the work brought me there. I stopped thinking about Lyra Aldrin. Almost completely. Almost. You don't think about how much you've packed away until something makes you unpack it all at once. That's the only way I can describe what happened when she walked out of that elevator. 5 years. That's how long it had been. I was 29 now. The company I drove for, Hartwell Executive Transport, had just landed a new corporate contract with a company called Aldrin Systems. It was Vela, I found out later. She'd rebranded and restructured after the IPO. The new name was her own. Lyra Aldrin had given her company her name. I hadn't known she was the client when I took the assignment. I hadn't put it together until I was standing in that parking garage, coffee in hand, waiting for the executive I was scheduled to pick up at 9 o'clock. Elevator doors, 14th floor, and then her. I've thought a lot about what it means to see someone after a long time and feel everything compress. All those months of managed distance collapsing back into the single unresolved moment you never quite finished. That's what happened. She saw me. She went still. Not dramatically, just that second of recalibration that people do when something they weren't expecting appears in front of them. And then she walked toward me. Because what else do you do when your car is waiting, and your driver is standing next to it, and you're two professionals in a parking garage at 9 in the morning? May, she said. Just like that. My name. The same weight it had always had. Good morning, I said. Professional, measured, steady. A moment passed between us that was doing a lot of work for a moment. It's been a while, she said. A few years, I said. She looked at me for another second. Then she nodded and got in the car, and I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side and sat down and breathed. The first week was almost clinical. She had calls from the moment she got in to the moment we arrived. I drove. I didn't speak unless spoken to. I told myself that this was fine. That enough time had passed. That whatever it had been back then was a thing that belonged to a younger version of me who hadn't known better. I was very articulate about all of this to myself. Very calm. And then, on a Friday afternoon, her last call of the day ended early. She put her phone down. The city was doing its early fall thing. Golden light, leaves starting to turn on the trees we passed on Commonwealth Avenue. The kind of afternoon that makes you feel like everything is about to change whether you want it to or not. She said, "Do you still listen to music?" I almost said something I couldn't take back. I said, "When it seems right." A pause. "It seems right," she said. I turned on the music. The same kind, low and instrumental, unhurried. She sat back. And we drove through the gold afternoon with the music playing between us, and 5 years hanging in the air like something neither of us was ready to touch. The second week was harder, because she started talking again. Not the way she used to, gradually, carefully, over weeks. This time, it was like no time had passed at all. Like her mind had picked up the same frequency we'd had before, without asking permission. She told me the IPO had been harder than she'd expected. Not the mechanics of it, the emotional part. The feeling of the company no longer being completely hers. She told me about a restructuring decision she'd made that she still thought about at night, 2 years later. 200 jobs she'd had to let go of to keep the rest of the company alive. She told me that she'd bought a house last year and still didn't feel like it belonged to her, even after 12 months. I listened. I drove. I offered things when the pauses asked for it. And it was the same. It was the exact same thing it had been, and I had no idea what to do with that. One morning, about 3 weeks in, she said, "You left." Just that. I knew exactly what she meant. "Yes," I said. "You never told me why." The light ahead turned red. I stopped. I watched the pedestrians cross. "I told you what I could," I said. Silence. "Was it enough?" she asked. "What you figured out." I thought about that for a long time. The light changed. I drove. "I thought it was," I said. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the trip. But I could feel the question still there in the car with us, taking up more space than the silence. The thing about Lyra was that she had never needed me to explain myself fully. She was the kind of person who listened to what wasn't said as carefully as what was, sometimes more carefully. And that was the most dangerous thing about her. Most people, you can keep something from them, and it stays kept. You build the wall, and they read the wall as simply a wall. They don't look for what's on the other side of it. Lyra looked, not in an intrusive way, not a prying, pushing, demanding way. She just noticed. And she had the patience to wait. I caught her watching me sometimes, in the rear view. Not the way you look at a driver. The way you look at a question you haven't decided whether to ask yet. I told myself I was reading into it. I had a history of that with her. I was a person who had learned to be careful with myself around her, and this was just old patterns being triggered by proximity. But here's what I couldn't rationalize away. One Tuesday morning, I was running marginally late due to a blocked intersection. Not significantly, 4 minutes. I sent the standard notification through the app. When I pulled up, she was standing outside already. The second she got in, she looked at me in the rear view and said, "Are you okay?" Not "you're late," or even what happened. "Are you okay?" Like the 4 minutes had been enough for her to wonder. I said, "Traffic. I'm sorry." She said, "I didn't mean the traffic." I kept my eyes on the road. "I'm fine," I said. She nodded. She went back to her phone. But the question sat there in the car for the entire drive. A different kind of person might not have cared what that question meant. A different kind of person might have let it pass as the small, courteous concern of someone who had gotten used to having me around. But I was not a different kind of person. I was exactly the kind of person who understood that Lyra Aldrin did not ask things she didn't mean, and she did not mean things she hadn't already thought through. I didn't mean the traffic. I thought about that sentence for days. And here is what that sentence broke open in me, slowly, over the days that followed. I had not been fine. Not fully. Not since she had walked out of that elevator. I had been managing myself. Efficiently. Professionally. Competently. I was very good at managing myself. I had learned it around her. The first time. And I had kept the skill. But managing yourself and being fine are not the same thing. And she had known that from 4 minutes of notification delay. There was a day, the following week, when we drove back from a late afternoon meeting in a suburb south of the city. The sky had been threatening rain all day and finally delivered, hard and sudden, the kind of fall rain that makes everything smell like earth and cold pavement. I pulled off briefly to wait out the worst of it, because visibility was low, and I didn't like rushing in those conditions. We sat there, parked on a side street, the rain hitting the roof of the car. She was quiet. I was quiet. The windows were beginning to fog at the edges. She said, "I thought about calling you." I didn't move. "After you left Meridian," she said, "I thought about it." The rain came down. "I decided it wouldn't be appropriate," she said. Her voice was even, factual, the way she talked about most things, like she was reporting something rather than confessing it. "It would have been complicated," she said. I didn't trust my voice right then, so I said nothing. "I want you to know I thought about it, though," she said. And then she went back to her phone, and the rain eased off, and I pulled back onto the road, and we drove the rest of the way in the specific silence of two people who have just moved a very heavy piece of furniture and don't know yet where it goes. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in my apartment and thought about what she'd said and what she hadn't said. I thought about the river in Brooklyn. I thought about the last morning, years ago, when I'd driven away from the Vela building and watched her in the rear view until she disappeared through the door. I thought about the fact that she had thought about calling, that she had decided not to, that she had told me that she had thought about calling. There are people who tell you things with words, and there are people who tell you things by telling you adjacent things that require you to do the math yourself. Lyra was always the second kind. She had been since the beginning. And I had always been the kind of person who did the math. What the math said was keeping me up at night. But before we go any further, if you made it this far into May's story, you already know that feeling. The thing she's carrying. That weight of words you've never said to someone who somehow already knows half of them. If this story is touching something in you right now, please click the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps me keep bringing stories like this to you. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. That way, YouTube will let you know the moment a new story goes up. Now I need to ask you something in the comments. Have you ever distanced yourself from someone not because they hurt you, but because staying close was starting to feel like too much truth? Tell me. I read every single one. And tell me too. What city are you watching from? I'll reply with a heart. Now, let's go back to May, because things are about to shift. It was the last week of October when everything cracked open. She had a long day, board meeting in the morning, 2 back-to-back site visits in the afternoon, a dinner that ran later than expected. By the time I picked her up at the restaurant, it was close to 10. She got in and didn't say anything. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. I drove. Somewhere on the expressway, she said, quietly, like she was talking to the ceiling more than to me. I'm so tired of being the person who holds everything together. I drove another mile before I answered. I know, I said. She opened her eyes and looked at me in the rear view. Do you? She said. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. I thought about what to say. I thought about the years between us, and the things still hanging unspoken, and the fact that it was 10 o'clock at night, and we were alone on an expressway, and she had just said something she probably hadn't said to another person in a very long time. I watched you for a year, I said, the first time around. I know what it costs you. A long silence. You watched me, she said. It was my job to pay attention. That's not what I mean, and you know it. I knew it. I kept my eyes on the road. My hands were exactly where they were supposed to be on the wheel. I left, I said, because I wasn't able to keep things in the right category anymore. And I thought that was my problem to manage. The highway unrolled ahead of us. The city lights were soft and orange in the distance. What changed? She said. You walked out of that elevator, I said. Silence. And you remembered me, I said. The way you said my name. I didn't imagine that. She was quiet for a long time. No, she said. You didn't. The weight of that word. No. So simple and so absolute. I've been careful, she said, for a long time, about a lot of things, including this. I know. Careful doesn't mean it wasn't real, she said. It means I thought I knew what was smart. I took the exit ramp, and the speed dropped, and the city came back into focus. The specific warmth of streetlights and brownstones, and the ordinary miracle of late October Boston at night. Do you still think that? I asked. That being careful is the smart thing. She was quiet for a moment. I think, she said, that I've been careful for 5 years and you walked back into my life anyway. And I'm sitting in the back of your car at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, and I just told you I'm tired and you said I know and meant it and... A pause. I think that I don't know what smart means anymore in the context of this particular situation. I pulled onto her street. The house was a few blocks ahead. The one she'd mentioned buying. The one that didn't feel like hers yet. I drove slowly. Can I tell you something? She said. Yes. When you requested the reassignment, I asked Carmen why. A pause. She told me it was for professional development. I didn't believe her. I said nothing. I didn't call because I thought I'd made you uncomfortable. Because the situation was complicated. Because you were the one doing your job and I was the one who had started to... She stopped. Started to what? I asked. A very quiet moment. Rely on you, she said, in a way that wasn't about transport. I had known that. I had known that for 5 years. But hearing it from her, in her own careful voice, in her own words, was something entirely different from knowing it. I pulled up in front of her house and stopped the car. The engine idled. Neither of us moved. "I don't want to manage this anymore," she said. I turned around, just slightly. Just enough to really look at her. "I don't either," I said. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me on the waterfront in Brooklyn 5 years ago. Fully, directly, without the professional layer on top. Just her. The person she was when no one was watching except me. "Okay," she said. Just that. One word. But it was the kind of okay that meant something had just stopped needing to be carried alone. She didn't invite me in that night. I didn't expect her to. We weren't people who rushed. We had both, in our different ways, spent years being precise about things. We weren't going to suddenly become careless just because the silence had finally cracked. She got out of the car. She stood in the open door for a second. And this is the thing I want to tell you, because it's the thing I keep returning to. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me for a moment. There are looks that say a great deal without saying a word. This was one of those. And then she went inside. I drove home. I didn't turn on the music. I didn't need it. The car was already full of something, not the uncomfortable fullness of things unresolved, but something quieter and more settled, like a room after a window has finally been opened. The next morning I picked her up at the usual time. Black coffee on the console for her. I'd started stopping at the place on Boylston she preferred without her asking. She got in and looked at it, and then looked at me, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was heading in that direction. She said, "You remembered." "I always remembered," I said. And that was it. No dramatic declaration. No moment where everything was named and categorized and labeled. Just the coffee on the console and the acknowledgement and the particular quality of silence that follows it. The silence that doesn't press you to fill it. We drove. She worked for part of it. Then she put her phone down and watched the city for a while. At a stoplight, she said, "I'm having dinner cooked at the house on Saturday. I'd like it if you came." Not as my driver, the context made clear, as something else. Something we didn't need to name yet. "I'll be there," I said. The light turned green. The weeks that followed were not a revelation. There was no single dramatic moment where everything was declared and transformed. It was more like an agreement reached by increments, coffee appearing without being asked for, a text message on a Thursday evening that was about nothing in particular and everything in general, a walk after the Saturday dinner that lasted longer than it needed to because neither of us wanted to stop talking. Lyra, it turned out, was funny. Not in the way you perform humor at events. In the quiet, specific way, an observation offered while looking at something else. A deadpan comment slipped into a serious conversation that caught me off guard and made me laugh in a way that felt like relief. I hadn't expected to find her funny. I'd always found her remarkable, but funny was new. She hadn't expected, I think, that I would argue with her. Not fight. Argue. There's a difference. I disagreed with her sometimes, on things that didn't matter and things that did. The first time it happened, over something completely inconsequential, a disagreement about a route she thought was faster than I knew it was. She went quiet for a moment and then said, "You're not going to back down, are you?" "I'm right," I said. A pause. Then, "Show me." I showed her. She looked at the data, looked at me and said, "Fine." "Fine as in I was right?" I said. "Fine as in you were right," she said. "Don't be smug about it." I was a little smug about it. She allowed this. There was a Sunday morning in November, about a month after that first Saturday dinner, when I went to her house to help her move some furniture she'd been meaning to rearrange since she bought the place. She'd mentioned it once, and then apparently taken it seriously. I showed up at 9 with coffee, and we spent the morning shifting things around her living room while she stood in the middle of the space, assessing. "It's better," she said, looking at the new arrangement. "It is," I agreed. She stood there looking at the room for another moment. Something was moving in her expression. Something that wasn't about the furniture. "I bought this house because I thought it would feel like mine eventually," she said. "Like I'd just moved in too recently, and it hadn't settled yet." "Does it feel like yours now?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the room, the furniture rearranged, the light coming through the windows the way it comes through in November, honest and clear. "More," she said. "Today it feels more like mine." She wasn't just talking about the house. I knew that. I didn't say it out loud. Neither did she. But we both knew it, and knowing it together without having to say it was the thing I'd been missing for 5 years without having the right word for it. That's what she gave me. Not a declaration, not a grand gesture. Just this. The experience of being understood so precisely that you don't have to translate yourself. December came. The city got cold in the way that Boston does. Seriously, uncompromisingly. The kind of cold that makes you glad to be inside. I drove her to work each morning. Some evenings I came to the house on Marlborough Street, and there was dinner that she'd ordered or occasionally cooked. She was a methodical cook, the kind that followed recipes like engineering specs and was affronted when things varied, and we sat at her kitchen table and talked. We talked about things we had never talked about in the car because we hadn't been ready. We talked about the river in Brooklyn. She remembered it too, exactly. She told me that on the drive home that night, 5 years ago, she had spent 45 minutes trying to figure out what she was going to do about the fact that she was falling in love with her driver. She said it exactly like that. Falling in love. Past tense about the present. Factual. Like a board report. I told her that I had gripped the steering wheel for most of a month trying to convince myself it was admiration. She looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "Did it work?" "Obviously not," I said. "No," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad you came back." "I didn't come back," I said. "The work brought me here." "Semantics," she said. "You love semantics." "I love precision," she said. "There's a difference." I looked at her across the kitchen table. The light was that specific winter kitchen light, warm and contained, the rest of the world outside in the cold. "Lyra," I said. She looked at me. "I'm glad I came back too," I said. Her expression did something quiet and specific, not a dramatic change, just a small settling. Like something that had been held carefully for a long time was gently, finally being put down. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. The house was quiet. The winter was outside. And for the first time in 5 years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I finally had what I'd spent years trying not to want. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't simple. It was honest. It was real, and it was ours. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't the grand gesture. Sometimes it's just staying in the room long enough for the silence to finally mean something good. If this story reached something in you, write Quieto in the comments. That's how I know you made it here with me. And if you want more stories that feel like this, real, slow-burning, and true, the next one is already waiting for you on your screen. A big hug. And I'll see you in the next story. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description.